talk about, in our last video, I want to talk about the oral law, which is different than the feasts. Different than the feasts. The Jews today, the rabbis teach in a non-messianic Jewish synagogue that there are two laws. And this is critically important to understand when we get to the Gospels. Why all the problems with the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Why are they always upset with him? Why are they always arguing with him? And 100% of the conflict, 100% was over the oral law. The handout that I'm going to send on this for you, it's kind of long, it's 7 pages. You can choose to read it all or not, but just summarizing it, they believe that on Mount Sinai, when Moses brought down the Torah, although he brought down 10 tablets of the 10 commandments, the Bible teaches that God told him at all this. There are 613 commandments in the Torah, from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There are 613 commandments. There are 365 negative commandments, don't do this, and 248 positive commandments, do this. 613. But the rabbis teach that Moses also brought down the oral law. Also brought down the oral law. That was not written down. So after the Babylonian captivity, Ezra and Nehemiah came back into the land, and what started off as a perfectly understandable and good thing, Ezra started, rabbinical schools. They realized that they had made a mistake, that they had violated the 613, and they didn't want to go into captivity again. So they started having rabbinical schools asking such questions as, what does it really mean to honor your father and your mother? What does it really mean not to covet? Those types of things. And so they started what they started to do was to build a fence around the Torah with these oral laws. They said that Moses had brought down. Well, at first, this oral law thing kind of gradually, that's what I explained in the handout, it gradually happened over a period of like 400 years. But at first, the theory for Ezra and those people, when they came back, they said, if we build a fence around the Torah, we might break this one. One of these oral laws, we might break that, but we're not going to penetrate in here and break one of the 613 and be subject to going into exile again. So what started off as a good thing, to think about what does it really mean to honor your father and your mother, etc. After 400 years, these oral laws became even a little bit more sacred to the Jews than the Torah. The rabbi said, whoever studies the Torah does a good thing. Whoever studies the oral law does an even better thing. So they elevated the oral law, which was completely man-made. Jesus called them the traditions of men, just of men. Jesus knew he had nothing to do with this. So, by the time of Christ, by the time he's born, this made-up, man-made thing of the oral law was elevated to at least equal, if not a little bit more than Scripture. And this is what the rabbis taught. They said, whoever when the Messiah comes, he will not only believe in the oral law, he will participate in the making of new oral laws. So, we have a big problem because Jesus didn't believe in the oral law, didn't follow the oral law. He's the only person in the history of the world that ever kept the 613 perfectly. So all during the Gospels, you hear them like Jesus and his disciples are walking through a wheat field and they're hungry. It's on the Sabbath. So his disciples take some of the wheat and they get it in their hands and they rub it together and blow away the chaff and eat the wheat. And the Pharisees go nuts because that was work to them. They had, in the oral law, they had to find this as work on the Sabbath. So they say, why are your disciples breaking the Sabbath? And Jesus said, we're not breaking the Sabbath. So 100% of the conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders in the Gospels are over the oral law. Now this is the killer. For every one of those 613, I think it's 1,500. For every one of the 613, there were 1,500 oral laws. And today, Orthodox Jews follow those. You know, that's why, you know, they take a step, oh, did I, they're like, Mom, did I step on a crack? Did I do something? Did I do something?
They couldn't keep them.
No, they weren't supposed to keep them. See, the whole point was this. They took God's high holy standard of Torah and pulled it down into the gutter of things they could do. Bruce Kresser's talking about Galatians and a tutor. The law was about how the law was a tutor. Well, a tutor, you know, what's a tutor? What was the Torah teaching? A tutor is just a teacher. What was the Torah teaching? The Torah was teaching, you can't do this. You can't do it. And so what was supposed to happen was the tutor was supposed to teach the Jews that they could not do this. So when Christ came and he says, take my yoke, it's easy, my burden's light, it's by faith. They were, oh, thank you, Lord. Oh, so easy, thank you. But they didn't do it. They perverted the Torah. They took God's high holy standard and they pulled it down into the gutter of things they could do. So for example, if you were a tailor, the oral law said if you do not carry your needle more than 25 steps, then you're keeping the Sabbath. And so if you were a tailor and you had a couch, whatever they had, and you sat down and you had a needle accidentally stick in your robe and you got up and walked more than 25 feet, you broke the Sabbath. So they're saying as long, or they said you couldn't take something more than so many steps. So they had like 25 people lined up with so many steps, and they would pass it down so they wouldn't break the Sabbath. They made up all kinds of things, okay? But Orthodox Jews today try to keep that stuff. So, the oral law, and we'll talk more about this next week, when I start talking about, next week we're going to talk about the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin was the Jewish Supreme Court. And it was their responsibility to identify someone as the Messiah. When the Messiah come, they were supposed to know it, and they were supposed to identify him. So this oral law thing was going to be a problem, because they taught that when the Messiah comes, he will not only believe in the oral law, he will participate in the making of new oral laws. And Jesus did none of that. So although he was doing a lot of things that the Messiah was supposed to do when he came, like miracles and healings and things, he was doing those things, but he didn't believe in the oral law. So the Sanhedrin had a big problem. So the oral law is really important to understand. We're going to be talking more about it. This isn't the only time we're going to be talking about it, but it is really basic to understanding of why Christ was rejected. Ultimately, he was rejected because of the oral law.